Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see so many in the room. And of course, we have people joining us online also, so welcome to those colleagues who are joining us online. We're hoping to provide you in this afternoon session with quite a riveting session through our esteemed panelists here, whom I'll introduce in just a short period of time. Today's discussion, adaptive security planning and security risk management. Are we prepared for the unpredictable? So, as we all know, in today's ever-evolving global landscape, security decision makers are faced with the formidable task of navigating difficult, dynamic, and diverse security risks and uncertainties. Security planning and security risk management processes are the cornerstone for decision makers in identifying threats and in mitigating the risks, in protection and safeguarding of humanitarian workers, and also in enabling operations. Our session today, we hope and propose to deep dive into aspects of security planning and security risk management, shedding light on the current challenges, and also exploring innovative strategies to adapt to changing circumstances. As we navigate through this discussion, we will hopefully draw on some real-world examples. We'll have some case studies, some experiences and best practices that will demonstrate the successful application and agility of security risk management. The safety and security of humanitarian workers is a critical imperative, and it requires us to foster a dynamic, flexible, and responsive approach to SRM, to security risk management. In the panel discussion today, we seek not only to understand the complexities of security planning, but also to empower organizations with actionable insights to enable field operations. The panel discussion itself will proceed for approximately 1 hour, after which we will have a Q&A session. For those online, we invite you, please, if you have questions as we go along, to put them into the Q&A chat box. And of course, for those in the room, if you can just raise your hand when the time is appropriate. And we're more than happy, well, I'm more than happy to pass your questions to the esteemed panel, whom I'm now going to introduce you to. So first of all, we have Paul Farrell. And Paul is the UNICEF Principal Security Coordinator. So welcome to Paul. We have with us also Brian Baker, and Brian is the UNWA Director of Department of Security Risk Management. So welcome also to Brian. We have Christina Veal, and Christina is the Insecurity Insight Director. So welcome, Christina. We have with us also Steve Gordon, and Steve is the Mercy Corps Senior Director of Global Security. Welcome, Steve. And finally, with us on the live panel here, we have Panayotis Olympiou, and Panayotis is the INSO Global Safety and Risk Manager. And I understand that we have Martin Laffey online. Martin is the Chief of Service for Operational Resilience Service for UNDSS. So very welcome, Martin, and thank you for joining us. Okay. My name is Anne Dorian, and I'm a Senior Field Security Officer working with UNHCR, and I'm going to be the moderator for this afternoon's session. So if I may, perhaps, Paul, I want to turn to you first and express that different humanitarian organizations understand and apply security risk management in different ways. Within your experience, and I understand that you have a considerable experience, what are some of the core concepts commonly understood across all humanitarian organizations when it comes to security risk management? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Good to see everyone in person. So this is an extremely complex subject of which I have 4 minutes to discuss, so forgive me if I don't do everything. I've said a few things in previous panels, one last week and one this morning, and I'm not sure if it's exactly the same in every organization, but let me try a big level conceptual idea here on risk. So first thing is risk is an organizational construct that organizations make in order for them to make sense of future events and all the uncertainty that goes with them. So it's a construct. There's nothing out there in the world you can actually find and call that's risk. It's an idea of how we make sense of the future. So in the process in general, it's about assessing what we believe to be, and they're assigning to it a certain likelihood that some future event may occur, and also assigning to it how bad that event would be if it were to occur, which is roughly called impact or effect, right? And this is, by assigning these values, we can then prioritize how we make interventions for possible future issues. By prioritizing ones we assess as higher than lower ones, it gives managers and decision makers some confidence that their investments to work with the future are prudent and well placed. So the money, the resources, and the efforts made are not wasted. The best confidence we can have. Next concept is distinguishing between threat and risk. So in security area, threat is roughly referred to as the cause. The cause of the problem. And in security, it's going to be a violent actor or it's someone wanting to cause violent effect on an organization, which is different from the risk, because the risk is the organization's vulnerability to that threat, expressed as a likelihood of a bad event occurring and how bad that event will be. So in this regard, to keep it as simple as possible, we are more or less vulnerable to these threat actors affecting us. And the more vulnerable we are, the higher the risk we have from that threat. So it's really, risk management is really vulnerability management at its basic, changing our vulnerability to these problems. Finally, the last concept that I'll pass back, hopefully I'm in my 4 minutes, Anne. No matter what we do, we can never eliminate all risk. We can never always eliminate all future likelihood of something occurring and making all possible bad things not bad. So in that way, there's always a residual leftover risk that we must accept. And this is the reality. And so this idea of residual risk is very important. But when we do so, we can prioritize the higher risks and then accept the lower risks. And that's how we make decisions on what we're going to do. And we can be confident that we're making the right investments. I have a way of explaining it in very simple terms. If we have 1 more minute, I like to use the example of scuba diving. So underwater is the most dangerous place for a human being to be. If you go underwater by yourself, you will drown and die within a minute, right? Yet we can go underwater in a low-risk situation by proper preparation, planning, and investments. That's what scuba diving is. We have equipment, we have training, and when we go and spend 45 minutes underwater, it's a high-threat, dangerous situation of which we are in a low risk for ourselves because we've managed it by managing our vulnerability to drowning. So that's just a simple example of the difference between the cause and the effect. And why this is important for organizations is we can control the risk. We can control our vulnerability, and that empowers us to keep going when we're in an environment. That's it.
Thanks, Paul. So Paul there spoke a little bit about the risk as an organizational construct to make sense of future events. And if we look at over the past decade, we see how humanitarian work has grown in scale and effectiveness. And this has generally contributed to the protection of civilians. However, at the same time, we note that violence, insecurity, threats, deliberate obstruction are increasingly recognized as constraints to further assistance. So Christina, if I may, what, from your perspective, does the current global security landscape look like, and why is security risk management important?
Thank you. I think, like Paul, I have a very big question here. And I think the very simple response to that question, what does the global security environment for the aid sector look like right now, is probably a single word: frightening. The levels of violence are extremely high. At Insecurity Insight, we monitor specifically how aid workers, the health sector, food security and education are affected by violence. And the increase in this level of violence, in particular over the last 24 months, is frightening. It really is frightening. And just to throw in one broad number, that over the last few months, we've seen as many aid workers killed, as many health workers killed in one country alone as we used to see in the whole world over one calendar year. That's what we're facing at the moment. But it is not just Gaza that's probably been on all our mind. It is also in Sudan, across the Sahel, that there are serious concerns around providing the vital humanitarian aid that's needed. So why does security risk management matter in such an environment? I think it is an essential tool, and it is such an essential tool because we are in a situation where I think respect for IHL alone does not provide access for the humanitarian sector. And that is why, at the moment, security risk management is not only a very important tool, but perhaps the only one we have in many cases right now. And I think the way Paul summarized the mindset to think about it, that is what we need to use to see what we can do to mitigate the terrible scale of suffering that is happening at the moment.
Thanks, Christina. So we heard there of the significant increase in levels of violence over the past 24 months. And in terms of the rapidly changing security environments that we're experiencing today, operationalizing security risk management is crucial in enabling humanitarian organizations to deliver their mandates and also to provide life-saving assistance. It needs to be agile, flexible, and also adaptive. If I may turn to Brian, please, and ask you, Brian, could you speak to how security risk management is able to be agile and adaptive in response to security volatility and instability, incidents of armed conflict, terrorism, and so forth, civil unrest?
No, thanks, Anne, and thank you to everybody for being here. I think, security risk management for me has always been agile, and agility comes from planning, from preparation, from ensuring the capacity building already exists. So when you have the subject unpredictable incidents occur, and I don't think many of them are unpredictable, they may be unprecedented, but certainly not unpredictable, then that agility is already there to plan for the future. If your staff, if your decision makers, your security practitioners, your programme staff, in UNRWA's case, even education staff, understand how to operate in these environments, then it becomes a lot easier. So what do we do for preparation on security risk management? Well, besides capacity building and looking at the human resources element, I think we also need to address the security data, because a lot of the security risk management, the risk events, the descriptors that Paul touched upon, comes predominantly from the data we see. I will touch more upon the Gaza situation maybe in another question, but by understanding the environment you operate allows you to plan better for the future. It allows you to prepare the SRMs for the current environments and then have the agility to step up when you need to step up. But when we talk about proactiveness, I think in most countries, armed conflict, terror incidents, civil unrest don't just happen in a heartbeat. So normally in the countries that we talk about and what Christina was referring to, the humanitarian agencies, the humanitarian personnel are already on the ground, which means we already have a baseline for the security risk management document. So if we ensure the baseline is there, we ensure decision makers understand where the baseline is, what level of acceptable risk we're working on. It also provides that ability to understand when we cross that threshold, when something catastrophic is actually changed, and that allows us to understand where we need to reassess security risk. So I think maybe that's certainly how UNRWA has operated over the last 4 years since I've been there, but also inclusivity with your programme staff, with your decision makers. It's got to come from the bottom up. Everyone has to understand their role and responsibility when we talk about that security risk management, just to ensure that we are on the same page. There shouldn't be this unpredictable, which is the subject of this panel.
Steve, if I may turn to you now, please. And just building on this understanding and planning in terms of operation and how that facilitates operations. May I ask you to speak to where security risk management has worked well and perhaps where there are gaps or challenges in operationalizing security risk management on the ground?
Thank you. I mean, to kind of frame this answer, I'm going to do it from an NGO perspective. You know, when you look at the difference between NGOs, the size of NGOs, and the level of resources compared to, for example, a UN department, it depends on that level of investment. We have seen a change. We have seen a significant change in how we approach things. Security risk management structures. I've been working in NGOs off and on 31 years now, and there's been this gradual approach. The conversation has always been around, you know, these security risk management structures, but the understanding when you start to roll that out into the field teams is less and less. I think now we're starting to get greater examples where people understand. I mean, using analogies, we've had the diving analogy, but I'll bore you with one I use all the time. That previously in NGOs, there was this perception that security was basically, it was behind a shut door at the end of a corridor where you only went when you were looking for permission to go somewhere, right? And that process was there'd be some guy in there, ex-military, and it's yes or no. I think security risk management, when you're looking for how that can push things forward, it's actually quite simple when it's coming down to yes-no decisions. The key thing is the information that informs that process. We can also talk about the level of departments sharing the risk and the understanding. Previously in NGOs, the security team was always seen as the one that the burden was on their back. But I think now, as we've gone into this more, you know, security risk management structured approach, those risks are shared. You know, financial risks, other things. There's a much better clarity and understanding how the impact in different departments and how things work together is just now. I mean, examples where I can speak personally from experience and say, you know, Syria is an example of a place where we had a team that was very much aware of risk thresholds, and you had a rapidly changing environment. And by having that contextual basis and understanding, you were able to move your resources about. You were able to shift quickly, rather than say, when one door closes, the other is shut. I think we have to also, from our perspective, this all needs to be part of a larger access structure as well. That notion that your moves, how you plan things, how you're looking, when you get these unexpected events, when you're viewing it through the kind of access prism, then you can change rapidly and keeping it nimble. I mean, now we talk about, you know, we've gone through this period where we had our indicators or our risk levels would change, and when you hit black, the game was over, right? You were either getting out or you were locked down. I think now the ability to stay and deliver is key and central. You know, obviously we've had that change since the attack on Canal House, but it's keeping that nimble within the team. It requires a level of investment to do so and keep that in place.
So just moving this forward a little bit in the context of this level of investment and the need for agility and how security itself has progressed over time, and also a little bit of focus on the ability to stay and deliver. If we look at security risk management, we're making recommendations for this investment about the future. Christina, may I ask you, how does security analysis and information inform security risk management?
Security risk management needs two sort of interlocking aspects. It needs the right procedures and guidance, and then it needs the analysis and information that informs the development of that guidance, but also the guidance, the guidance needs to be, or what needs to be done is adapted to the context. And I mean, I think as everyone already said, the key thing about security risk management is the mindset that you try to understand the context, and you will never be able to predict exactly what will going to happen, but you're prepared for what you understand may happen, and you put that in place. But what I think is really important, and that goes to the point that sort of Stephen just meant about being there to deliver. And I think this is how we need to really think about the diversity of context that we can get from analysis and information, because it differs the risk to a driver than to an accountant. And there is also a different risk to different programs. Vaccinations may be particular under attack, or food distribution practices, so that there can be specific activities, and understanding that and adapting the risk to not just the environment and what the threat actor tells us, but also what it is we are doing and how we are understanding that the threat actor interacts with the objectives of the humanitarian imperative. And I would always say, for the information we put out, the biggest compliment I think we can have is when someone said, we adopted our SOPs based on the information and analysis you provided. But that, I think, highlights some other element, that really good security risk management remains invisible in the analysis, because good security risk management means that you don't have an incident, you prevent it, and you prevent the impact. And that doesn't necessarily feed into our analysis and information in a sufficient way, that it is sometimes, I think, difficult to convince colleagues who are not directly from the security risk management field to really understand how important the work is. And that's where I see the other link between analysis and information and security risk management.
Panayotis, if I may go to you, or come to you next, please. And when we talk about this diversity of context and the different risks to different programs and so forth, may I ask, are there commonalities here from your perspective working with INSO also?
Thank you, Anne. In many ways, yes, perhaps with some additions. I mean, data and analysis and information, we could have a whole session on this. And actually, there was a session last Friday, which was very interesting. And in that session, Michael Walker, the director of research of INSO, made many points about how INSO tailors information and curates data for the specific audience of INSO, that is our humanitarian partners. I will echo many of his points, but from the perspective of a security risk manager, since I'm doing our security risk management for INSO. And for me, when it comes to analysis and information, I see them as the input, as the raw material for security risk management. And equally importantly, I see them as the enabling factor, as key to a security risk management that is enabling and not restraining to programs. Now, before I come back to this, I'd like to speak a little bit to categorize roughly information and analysis. And first of all, we have the quantitative, more quantitative data, which give us the modalities of a context and a conflict. and also gives us trends, maybe some short-term or other that are long-term, and these are informing our day-to-day operations and gives us the baseline, as Brian said earlier, about what is happening there in a context. Then we have some more qualitative information which might come from a very wide range of sources. Some come from analytical work like that of INSO. Some might be coming from the staff of individual agencies or partners and other interlocutors. These, in my view, are essential not only for the day-to-day security risk management, but they have an added value when it comes to contingency planning and when it comes to, so to speak, creating a bracketing what is possible in the context where an agency or an organization operates. In the crossover, in the nexus of the first type of data and the qualitative data that I spoke about now, we have scenario planning, we have horizon scanning to try to get a sense of what might the future hold. And one might say that this is where the black swans live, which is something that we might touch upon later on. But there is a third type of information that I need, and that is information about the organization itself. What are the vulnerabilities of the organization? What are the capacity of my organization or my team in the specific country? What are the programmatic work and objectives that we have there? And in under programmatic information, we can speak also about conflict sensitivity, about acceptance in the context and duty of care, as well as tolerance of risk. Now, one might ask, why do we need to have this information about the organization itself, the organization that is operating and for which we're doing this security risk management? Well, the objective, for me at least, as a security risk management at INSO, is to serve programmatic objectives. I need to have INSO staff being outside as much as possible. I want them to be in locations where humanitarian work is actually implemented. I need them to be engaging with local leaders. I need them to have a first-hand understanding of what is the context so that they can deliver, they can understand, analyze, and provide analysis and advice to our partners. To do that, we need to allocate resources, and it is with this information about the context, but also our introspective analysis, that we are able to support programs instead of coming with a blanket set of rules or a blanket set of security risk management templates that will not necessarily match what we can do in the field. And such information and the combination of all these is what gets us to get the best programmatic outcomes that we can in the most safe and secure way, based on a risk tolerance, based on also on program criticality. In some cases, we might need to turn down, we might need to not turn down, but we might need to revise certain programmatic objectives because it might be that we don't have the necessary capacity, or there might be reputational repercussions if we try to achieve the level of security measures that would enable a certain activity to happen while also fulfilling our duty of care. So in short, information and analysis is what makes security risk management enabling for programmatic objectives and not restraining. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So if we combine some of this conversation and we're looking at vulnerabilities, we're looking at context, we're looking at different issues around risk to different programs and so forth. And when we look at emerging threats and risks in terms of shaping and planning our security risk management, Martin, if I may turn to you online with us, please, and say to you that there's a certain amount of conversation in security circles currently about foresight. What is foresight? and how does this fit in to security risk management? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Good morning, rather in your time. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to join you. Let me first say that we all try to develop foresight already. I mean, it's nothing new. Everybody is trying to get ahead of the curve. Perhaps there is a renewed focus on it, and there's probably a couple of reasons for that. But it's important to say up front that foresight is not about prediction. It's about identifying what are the most likely future scenarios. Paul referred to this before. Foresight is analysis, essentially. It's just not analysis of the current risks, but of the potential future scenarios that we might need to apply the SRM process to, including security planning. So I think that's important to say straight up. I'd also suggested in the past, in our profession, we've tended to concentrate mainly on the security-related criteria in our attempts to see over the horizon at what crisis might be coming, or those that have the higher likelihood to occur in the medium term. But the causes of crisis, of course, are driven by many things, much broader, than just security issues, an invasion, a militia attack against a government, a coup, etc. And I think what we're doing now, I think more broadly, not only the UN but across industry, is acknowledging that it doesn't matter what sort of crisis or what will drive or cause a crisis or an emergency in a country. There are likely to be secondary or tertiary security impacts for programming. So for those on the ground, an example, it might be a natural disaster that will then go on to cause looting, which will mean the rise of criminality, and that is going to have, or has the potential to impact the way we do programming, all of us. But that might not have been primarily security caused. So we see, I think, along with this recognition that we need to scan for a broader range of emerging threats, the drivers of those emerging threats, we can see that is going to help us create better scenarios so that we can start to look at what are those scenarios and what are the ones that are most likely to occur. And if they're different to the ones that we are used to, we apply the tools that we have for both the assessment of it, but also the planning for how we will operate through these threats, understanding what the likelihood and the impact is going to be for us, the risk. In itself, foresight doesn't really mean anything if we don't use it, and it's important that as we get better data analysis going, that's going to help us to assess what's most likely. But again, I come back to, we must have these effective risk assessment measures in place if we're going to make use of better foresight. It's, having said what I've said about different drivers and a broader set of criteria, it's also important not to then endlessly chase our tail on these scenarios, because I come back to one of the points that Paul made before about likelihood. We're in the probability business, not possibilities. Somebody could ride through the conference now on a pink elephant. Is it possible? It's possible. It's not likely. It's not probable. So I think one of the aims of foresight is not just to identify what's going to occur and where, but the type of crisis and how likely it is to impact us. And then we're in the risk business. I'm not going to say it's a trendy term. I don't think anything that advances the use of analysis to tell us what we might be dealing with is trendy. I think it's a very useful term, but I would suggest that it's going to be a lot more valuable as more analytical techniques come online, and the use of data helps us to look a little bit further ahead. It's not a silver bullet, but it won't catch everything that will happen, but it will certainly allow us to be proactive. I think in the past, We've been operated at the tactical, the field level, but also I don't think that necessarily we've been able to get that horizon going that we would, that more distant horizon going that we would like in terms of our analysis.
Thanks, Martin. So Panagiotis, if I may come back to you on this one, and just acknowledging what Martin mentioned there in terms of accepting that effective risk measures in place, looking at the broader range of emerging threats. So given that black swan events, which you already alluded to very briefly, are somewhat unpredictable, is there anything that we can learn from them when we're operationalizing our security risk management?
Well, black swan events, and maybe I'll take an extra minute to just clarify what a black swan event is in the risk management wider literature, if you wish, and thinking. Black swan events are events that have catastrophic impact to those affected by them, which are inherently unpredictable. We cannot foresee a black swan. If we foresee an event, it is not a black swan. It's simple as that. And finally, it's an event that when we look at it in retrospect, it is something that we can explain rationally. So with this in mind, and some examples of it is the financial crisis of 2008 has been a main at the center of the discussion of black swans. The takeover of the Islamic Republic in Afghanistan by the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, by the Taliban in 2021. Some said that it was a black swan event, that it was not foreseen, and it had a great impact on organizations and politics. It's this kind of, this is the nature of the events that we're talking about. Now, what we have learned about black swans when it comes to foresight and preparedness is that we do not really need to predict them. We need to be prepared for their outcome or outcomes, because it might be that we are, it might be that we are affected in different ways. It's different organization. So a few things that we have seen when it comes to such events is that these events are comprised of multiple outcomes. So there is no, it's not just one outcome. It's not one event. In reality, it's the confluence of many events and smaller developments, and that people and organizations, humanitarian organizations, do foresee the outcomes of many of these individual events, of all these smaller events. And also many have the capacity and the ability to respond effectively and activate contingency plans to these kind of events. So another interesting fact is that for those who are prepared, there is an upside. In the 2008 financial crisis, some people who positioned themselves correctly, they made money out of, they made great profits out of the collapse of the market. In Afghanistan, for example, we saw that those organizations who had prepared themselves effectively, they were able to expand their humanitarian activities at a critical moment for the people of Afghanistan and deliver effectively humanitarian aid at a very difficult juncture for the country. And finally, that time is a critical factor in how we understand these events. Many organizations in Afghanistan had discussed the possibility of Kabul falling to the Taliban, but for the most part, people thought that this is going to happen at some point in the future, not right now, the way that they actually, in the end, experienced it. So, in many ways, we have ways to we can engage in analysis, in scenario planning, in horizon scanning, which are some of the techniques that perhaps colleagues will discuss, to try to understand what the future might hold. We're not able to predict it accurately, but we don't necessarily need it. We don't need it. But the problem with this kind of analysis and thinking is that it's lofty. It's pretty imaginative, and it can lead in many different ways. And then it's hard to decide where to put your resources. So we need to make a selection about where to put the resources, what kind of contingency planning to put in place. And here what is interesting is that many different scenarios might appear as discrete, as unique in their development or outcome, but in reality, across different scenarios, often there are common articulations of events that and common security measures or contingency measures that organizations are able to have in place to address these events. So one good way to go about it is to create spaces where such discussions can be happening regularly and in a structured way, so that it is something that is not out of the regular preparation of an organization, which makes it easier to discuss this kind of as I said, lofty prospects. So overall, if we use the security risk management tools, and we have seen it in practice, they are able to get us through many of the outcomes, not all of them, but many of the outcomes of Black Swan events.
Okay, so thanks. Accepting the inherently unpredictable in terms of the Black Swan events, and also acknowledging the confluence of many events coming together to result in this. Martin, if I may come back to you, please, and ask you if there are any good examples of practice in the field where the effective use of analysis and foresight have directly influenced security risk management and crisis response strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Look, I think there's lots of examples of good analysis in many places, mainly country and regional level. I would suggest they don't get noticed. Harking back to what I said before about foresight being sort of more about the horizon, a different horizon of the analytical techniques we use. I think we only hear about examples of analysis when they fail, more likely. And given what I said about foresight, it's the same because of the different horizon of analysis, which is essentially what foresight is. And it's not a term that we've used or we've acknowledged until recently, so it's difficult to come up with them. I'll give you an example of some operational analysis that also sort of bordered on that foresight, that forecasting of possible future scenarios. Goes back again to Gaza, 2021. Brian and I were there together. It was an example of short-term foresight, identifying the likelihood of a future scenario or a pattern that would occur in the future, likely to occur. That's the repeated airstrikes. We weren't able to put a time on it, but that use of those techniques to not to predict but to forecast what was likely to happen and where it was, allowed that security risk assessment process to work and very, very quickly go over to a change of plans. For instance, given only 2 shelter-in-place locations, people were moved around those so that the normal course of program business, meetings, etc., calls, coordination, collaboration could happen without having to travel. It was done so that with an acknowledgement of that scenario will happen. These specific risk events would happen, and we would operate through them. That's an example, I would suggest, of operational level foresight. It's a simple, example of the way we do analytical thinking, but it's the reason I use that example is, although it's operational, it's all about allowing operations to continue. So even if that forecast doesn't necessarily give you a timeline or indicators, but it shapes the way you plan for a future requirement to program against a risk scenario, then I think it's worthwhile. Let me attempt to give you another example of a longer term use of foresight. Chad, UN deployed a more senior team and some additional resources to Chad about probably 6 months ahead of when the indicators of more instability or pronounced instability started to emerge, led to a strengthening of a security team at a time where, again, those processes to assess what might happen in the future and to plan for it were at quite an early stage. So that's probably one that I'd point to for us as we develop in the UN or in UNDSS, that attempt to use foresight as a tool. And again, I go back to what I said before. It's important to look at the shift in what criteria we're looking at. Increasingly, as I said, it's broader than those traditional indicators of security risk. And the reason we're now concentrating on foresight more is, of course, that we have historically been reactive. And now that we have some techniques that will allow us to trend and to wait and to consider a much broader set of criteria on drivers of potential emergencies, of crisis, we are looking to use that to become more proactive. The other reason, of course, is that the humanitarian community globally is responding to more and multiple crises at the same time, with more complexity, mostly, and more overlap. So it's an operational imperative that we get the ability to look further ahead. The other thing that goes with foresight, of course, is readiness or preparedness, of course, and it underpins anything we do. It's no use seeing what is coming if we don't have the ability to put something in place. And I think a lack of preparedness in the past has also hindered any advantage that we've been able to get with local or regional foresight analysis that might have been developed. I think that's really important. Ukraine is probably an example. We had an analyst that predicted. I shouldn't use that word; it's bad. Who forecast the almost the exact scenario and almost the timeline within 4 or 5 days, which allowed us in some ways to get ahead and pre-position people. We took, for instance, DSS and OCHA took the crisis coordinator in a number of days only after the invasion. But our preparedness came in for quite sharp criticism. So I think those two, it's important to see that those two go together.
Thanks. So building on this strengthening of preparedness, and when we link this to the concept of anticipatory action, which is one of the big cross-cutting areas of the HNPW and one of the concerns of the HNPW, Christina, if I may ask you, how well does the SRM process then post this kind of horizon scan? How well is that fit for purpose?
Thank you. I wish a lot of the anticipatory action colleagues would be in the room here, because in many respects, I think security risk management gives a lot of answers there. So anticipatory action comes from disaster risk management, and it's the idea that you be prepared to respond to that. But there's been this attempt to also to predict conflict, and predictably, as we've sort of already heard here at the panel, that's just not possible. So I think I would very much agree with everything that's been said here. The predictive element is on the consequences of particular events. So if you know an armed group has stolen a solar panel from a health facility in the Central African Republic, you can predict that there will be disruption of the cold chain. You can also predict that you have difficulties bringing a new solar panel into the country. And these are elements you can address. And I think it is that sort of thinking that can also help really these programmatic responses. But I want to perhaps end on one sort of other example where within the security risk management field, we have to think even wider, because there has been an example of an attack in Burkina Faso, in a town in Burkina Faso coming under attack last November. And the humanitarian community was very effective in evacuating staff in good time. But the result was that this horizon skinning, this predictable ability that's the consequence of good security risk management, was perceived as proof that the humanitarian agencies are collaborating with the attackers. And that caused a lot of disinformation on social media. So we need to be also careful that our ability to getting good at predicting is not misperceived by those who don't actually have these skills. So it's really important to develop this, but perhaps also to talk more to colleagues outside the security risk management field.
Okay, thanks, Christina. So Martin, I'm going to come back to you as we move into the last 10 minutes of the panel discussion. And we're going to look a little bit at this scenario and security planning concepts. So in security planning, the ability to anticipate and analyze emerging threats and risks to humanitarian operations and humanitarian personnel, of course, is critical. What is crisis risk, Martin, and how does this inform scenario building and planning?
Thanks, Anne. Look, I'd say when we're using this term crisis risk, I think it goes back to what I said before. We're looking at the likelihood and the impact of future emergencies. But more importantly, I think it's the fact that we're looking broader than the primary drivers of what we've historically looked at when we look at security risk. I think the aim of identifying what crisis risk is, and you know, through looking at this broader set of criteria. Sorry, I'm getting a bad echo. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay. I think the idea of it is to get a better sense of the type of crisis that we're going to be dealing with. The importance of this is because if we know what we're dealing with, we can understand what the measures are, sure, for programming. But in the security environment, it's how we support that programming. And it goes back to what I said before. You might not have you might not have high security risk in an area where you're dealing with a crisis, but there may over time be circumstances that shift or develop so that there will become security risks to the people that are providing your humanitarian operations. I think initially, while security may not be something that every crisis will think of as either a limiter or an enabler, I think we've got to acknowledge that emergencies or crises, of whatever type, don't stand still, and they may improve, but they may worsen, they may change, they may morph. Whatever the reason, I think there's two things. If we look at different types of criteria to forecast what might be coming, so I think where crisis risk is about identifying what might come, getting us to the start point earlier, so that our processes that we've used and have honed can be put into place. I'm sorry, I'll stop there. I can't
Okay.
myself.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Martin. Brian, if I may turn to you, and just developing on this enabling paradigm, may I, or can you speak to or share with us any examples or best practice from UNWRA that have, in terms of effective security planning and enabling humanitarian operations and assistance?
Yeah, no, thanks, Anne. I mean, with UNRWA, we work in a small geographical area. We cover 5 countries, so predictability is always there. And, you know, I reference the subject of this discussion. You know, are we prepared for the unpredictable? I mean, if I give a best practice in Gaza, we're 6 wars old in 15 years. So we shouldn't be, it wasn't unpredicted that what was unfolding in October 7, 2013 was never going to happen. It was almost inevitable. So what's the best practices we learn from that? Well, one, as Martin referred to, there was a conflict in 21, there was a conflict in 18, there was a conflict in 14, 13, 2009. When the conflict in Gaza started in October, UNRWA already had the security risk management document in place. It was on the shelf. We knew it was coming. We didn't know when it was coming, but we knew it was coming because it comes every 2.5 years on average. So having a risk management document, because the modus operandi of conflicts in such a small geographical area, the event descriptors are there. They're already there. Injury, fatalities under bombardment, civil unrest, destruction of UN assets, installations, destruction of programs, etc. So with that in mind, what UNRWA did as a best practice is after 2021, we sat down with the SRM that was used for the 2021 conflict, and we developed it, we improved it, we looked at the lessons learned from the 2021 conflict, and then we practiced it. We went through it with the decision makers. We went through it with our staff who would be operational on the ground during the conflict, those staff who are still operational today. And that allowed us to be better prepared. We all knew exactly what we were going to face, maybe in this conflict a little bit different, but from a security risk management, the documents we used really did play out to our advantage by having them on the shelf ready to roll out. And that saves a lot of time. One more example when we talk about life-saving, you know, from 2021, the ferocity of the bombardments around our compound, you know, they were really bad. So what did we learn from that? Okay, we need a bomb shelter. We need to reinforce a bomb shelter in the compound, not just for UNRWA, for the humanitarian actors on the ground. And for sure, in the first 5 days with the bombardment around the compound, this saved lives. So that was using our best practices. We were learning our lessons from the failures of previous incidents to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes. And when we look beyond Gaza and across the region, we talk about unpredictability. Again, we have developed that model. Nobody can say it's unpredictable that there may be intra-factional conflict in Lebanon in the coming 6 months. Nobody can say it's unpredictable if it happened. Nobody can say there can be conflict between Israel and Lebanon in the next 6 months. What we do is we're planning for the worst case scenarios, we're hoping for the best case scenarios. But we need to ensure the documents are there, the plans are there. And maybe just to finish on that, why did we not use the security risk management document that was on the shelf after 2021 until October 7, is because we want to ensure that we're fully maximising that enabling process. We don't want to inhibit the idea of delivering by putting in the extreme measures before a conflict starts. So we work on, whilst there's no conflict, here's what we can and cannot do. When there is a conflict, here's what we're limited to do. So it's all about ensuring that that enabling is in place. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Brian. Steve, if I may turn to you, and I'm conscious that we have about 5 minutes or so left for our panel discussion because we want to give the audience and our colleagues online an opportunity for Q&A. So the humanitarian community has experienced a number of crises in recent years. I mean, we have Afghanistan, we have Ukraine, Sudan. Have we learned lessons, and are there still things that we need to learn?
There's lots to learn. I mean, that's the interesting process of how you take these examples forward. I mean, one thing I'd like to kind of stress here, though, is, and particularly when you have less capacity and less resources, is there's a human element to this, and that's something we have to focus on. We can give examples of countries where the analysis has been spot on, and you've got those predictions in black and white, and you know what's coming, but does the team have the investment and the understanding in what we're talking here about risk management and how that goes forward? There is a human element to this, and I think the investment needs to be in individuals that are able to make these decisions at hard times. That's something we can't forget. No spreadsheet is going to save it if someone's not going to be able to act on that information. So a key thing is, you know, if your resources are limited, invest in the individual to get that, so you've got that capacity there. I mean, NGOs, we look at things, we look at these events as they go forward. We can talk about mistakes that are made. And I think NGOs need to accept that the world has become much more insecure. And we've had these made, what we call major surprises, let's say, such as Myanmar, Sudan, as examples. But you need to remember that within the organisations, there's this confusion over the risk threshold. A lot of these places, the problems that came were because the organisation was very development focused as such. You know, it lacked that emergency capacity. And the reality is that that ability to switch, you know, when I look, for example, with our Gaza team, they are based off that. We did a lot of long-term development programs, but because of the constant wars, that ability to change gear back and forward was built into them. A lot of other programs don't have that capacity. And when countries have a lower risk threshold, getting that money to build that into your teams is harder to get out of institutional donors. It requires an investment, significant investment. It also, one thing that continually gets overlooked is the history of organizations. You can have the best security risk management planning on earth, but if there's some historical incident that you don't have the full understanding of, it can impact your registration, it can resurface. NGOs really need to get better at being honest with themselves of what their problems have been, when their problems are, and how that can impact them moving forward as well. I mean, Martin made a couple of, here was 2 words he said, we're reactive. Yeah, the problem is we are very reactive. We lack that preparedness. And I think now looking forward, as I say, having that emergency capacity, those resources that you can move quickly, therefore we can support these when we get these rapid moving and different kind of events on the ground as we go forward. Investment has been one of the key areas. We keep going back to that. The need to kind of build up and have that and information there. But I think we also need to look at our teams. And for me, security management, it needs to be part of who your organisation is and what you are. I think we need to be better at being more diverse and where we come from. We need to think about who we're selecting, and if we're not getting the right candidates who understand how to do these things, we need to develop these work streams ourselves. Otherwise, we're just playing lip service to this as we move forward.
Okay, thanks. Panayotis, very briefly, if you don't mind, in the interest of time, please. In terms of, we had a session this morning dealing with optimizing resources and collective and collaborative strategies. So when we talk about preparing and how we best prepare for crises, what collectively as a humanitarian community can we do better?
Yeah, I think the key here, to keep it brief, is to use information sharing networks to exchange information between the different organizations, and to do this before any crisis, and to do this regularly so that it is in advance of any kind of critical situation. What is key in this process is that we need to have the opportunity to challenge each other's biases in such fora, to have the opportunity to get different understanding, different angles of what is the conditions in the context, and very importantly, to not have assumptions about what the action of other organizations will be, unless we have a clear understanding between the different organizations, unless we have this kind of discussions. I speak about assumptions because often what we see, or what I've seen and what we've seen at INSO, is that organizations at times of crisis often expect other humanitarian organizations to respond in similar ways to the conditions, whether it comes to activation of contingency plans, evacuations, or remaining in a context. And this is not, there is no common understanding and no, and most of the time there is no common action. Different organizations have different mandates, and therefore they will take different capacities also, and therefore they will make different, they will take different actions. So in such fora, at INSO we have security roundtables at the local level, at the country director level. When it comes to our partners, we need to have, we offer the opportunity for such exchanges of information to take place. And here it's important also to say that the duty of care remains with individual organizations, so they need to be leading with the planning process of their own organizations. Where we have the opportunity for wider coordination, for example, through the Saving Lives Together framework, when we are able to break down these assumptions, it works very well, and where INSO is in the field, we managed to do that. A recent example was Haiti, where we had an air bridge between, organized by the humanitarian community with resources from the UN, between the Dominican Republic and Port-au-Prince, where the airspace was closed, and rather it was not accessible by air, but there were needs for movement of staff and so on. Similarly, about a year ago in Sudan, when the crisis there began, we were able to quickly, it was with GSF that we were put in touch with the International NGO Forum there, and quickly we were able to get a wider cooperation and organization going within the humanitarian
So I think
community.
this underpins the collaboration aspect.
Yeah.
We spoke at the start about the implications and the tasks that are faced with decision makers in terms of security risk management. Paul, I think Martin clearly said that foresight is not prediction. So when we talk about predicting the future in the broadest concept here, what can we expect in terms of security risk management? And should we or can we expect perfection?
So I'm conscious of time. I'm happy to hear questions and happy not even to answer this if you want to ask me other ones. But okay, quickly. My favorite quote is, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future, right? And so, and think about this discussion, right? We can talk about foresight that something could happen in the country. That's a big difference from that. And I know that that's going to affect my organization in this way, at this time frame, in this place, right? And so the more detailed it gets, the more difficult it is. So what does that mean for security risk management if it's an organizational construct? It means we'll never, ever able to say with confidence that we know the likelihood of something happening to our organization. We'll never know it. But what we can, though, with great confidence, is that if we assess something as more likely and something as less likely, they are indeed different from each other. And we can prioritize the ones we see as more likely than ones that are less likely. And the same with impact. So really it's a relative ranking. It's not an absolute knowledge, it's relative. And therefore we feel confident to prioritize the ones that are relatively higher up in our ranking. In this, for decision makers, they need to know a few things. One, the imperfections in the assessment process. They need to know the uncertainty of the assessment due to lack of knowledge and the lack of clear picture. The imperfect nature of the security measures, as we mentioned, the human aspect. Right? People are involved, it's imperfect. And they also need to know there's always going to be residual risk, I mentioned. And residual risk means residual likelihood, which means even unlikely things still occur. And this is important for managers because we cannot use the occurrence as proof there was a failure. It could be you do everything right and something still happens, because that failure part is really where it all falls backward when we start blaming people for something that was really not in their ability to predict or prevent. Thanks.
So Brian, just very quickly, just noting what Paul has said there, in terms of navigating resistance or organizational barriers or working with what we have, in terms of ensuring the adoption of security risk management.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've seen over the years is quite often security practitioners, security officers, they almost become like police officers. Everybody wants to speak to them when something's gone horribly wrong. And I think that is part of where we see this resistance. For me, we have a framework of accountability and we adopt a decentralized decision-making process. And I think that's very important. It's important that we train our staff, we train our security decision makers, again, from the bottom up, of what is their function within the framework of accountability. Where are their limitations on decisions that they can make? What is it they don't understand? What is it they do understand? And that can allow to ensure that we actually discuss these issues before, again, we become the police officers and we only get the phone call when something has gone horribly wrong. So I think in a nutshell, it's decentralisation, it's ensuring there's a good framework of accountability, and it's ensuring everybody is empowered to understand what that framework of accountability means.
Okay, so thank you very much, Brian. Just in summing up from the panel perspective, maybe it's opportune to take one of the questions from the colleagues online, and it feeds into what I was going to speak to Paul about, coming to the conclusion from the panel. The colleague online suggests that it's hard to predict the future and it's crucial to prepare for various possibilities. This preparation helps you with future threats that may arise, and seeking our thoughts from the panel in terms of the role of personal security training, such as heat training, in this preparation. And also, maybe Paul, if you can quickly put in also in terms of the information in supporting decision makers and the investment in that. The role of security, personal security training is one of those, but the wider management decisions around that. Thanks.
Okay, I mentioned earlier, I think in another panel, that it's also the measures and procedures, right? There's the human aspect of how staff and managers interact with our security to make it effective, and it's key. That's where often the failures happen, in the actual implementation, the human implementation of this. So when it comes to training, like heat training or safe training, anything that can reinforce to staff that they have a crucial role to play. We don't want to have a culture where staff see security as they're passive consumers of security. We need to create a culture where they're actively engaged in it, both in giving us feedback on what works, but also giving us information, et cetera. For managers, just to take my, there's always a residual risk problem. We need to have a culture where managers and decision makers are confident to make decisions with incomplete information. And one of the issues, and I'll leave this for everyone at the end, is often what we do after an incident. That makes a big difference in what we're going to do in the future. So there is a logical fallacy called the fallacy of predicting the past. Something happens and people go, oh, I know what caused that. It's way more complex than you think. And therefore, also, I could have prevented that. It's a fool's errand, right? We have to, and if we do that after an incident, future managers go, oh, I'm not going to take a chance, right? So we have to reinforce the fact that they're working in incomplete information in a very complex situation, and decisions are better than worse, but they're never perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, pardon me, I didn't put on my mic. If anyone from the floor has any questions, please. Yes, please.
Just a quick one for Steve and Brian. You both mentioned how you had learned lessons from previous conflicts in Gaza. How well did the last couple of months fit within your scenarios, and how do you think that will improve your planning in the future by how well those aligned?
Thanks, John. I'll go first then. I mean, from our perspective, there's points when operationally and the ability to turn the team around has worked. I think the failure of foresight is the wrong kind of terminology. But I think now we realise that rather than sit back, I mean, now the immediate response now is looking at that, gaming out that larger conflict, the regional conflict that everybody thought started the other night, you know, when the rockets were fired. It backed down, but the reality is, instead of waiting for that, I mean, there is a level of predictability there. Brian already mentioned that when we look at Lebanon, we look at these other parts. I think rather than waiting for them to happen, I think we have to use this moment. Paul just made that point on you have this moment. Someone from another agency many years ago told me in all wisdom, they said, you have 9 days after an incident to change things, otherwise the opportunity is gone, right? And we're still at that point that now we have to push through that kind of more forward planning and look at these things and get people. With NGOs, it's very difficult. You're dragging program teams that are very focused on what they are doing behind you, saying, no, you have to look at this. And they're like, well, if it's not going to happen, why should I? I think it's changing that and that being accepted as a valuable investment, even if the scenario doesn't go wrong. That's the problem with our game. If we're right, nobody knows because it doesn't happen, right? It's like, but the failures there's a chance to kind of point at people and put it out. I think we need to move away from that psychology of proving that we're predicting the correct events.
Yeah, look, I don't think anything. So the unpredictability then becomes predictable. So I think what's happened over the past few months has become predictable. What's happening in Gaza today with Rafah becomes predictable. And again, it's all about planning and preparing for those next steps to take place. I mean, what we've got to recognise is there's limitations. As good as the best practices are, there are still limitations and there are impossible asks. The impossible ask of ensured safety to staff when there is no relocation policy. There is not relocation policy where staff are not permitted to be relocated by the occupying powers and so forth. So there are limitations to it, but the predictability, I think, becomes more predictable after the unpredictable event actually occurs, and it's how we adapt to that that's important.
Please.
As the security ally mine of the One Goal Initiative for Governance, as the security needs are rising, the question arises: the resources at hand at some point will not, suffice. So, is there anything that can be done with infrastructure, with digitalization, with automation, or is there anything that is being done in those areas? And then with foresight, how to deal with the issue of the perception as being in connivance, and also how to use the heads up to, one, prevent or reduce the size of the conflict, so it takes, I suppose, coordination with other fields, and to evacuate the people at the same time as, or in the same plan as the personnel. Thank you.
If I may is it on the same subject, or if I may, I'll come to you in 2 minutes, please. I'll just put this to the panel. So we're looking at how to manage the issue of perception, the context of size of the conflict, evacuation of people. Any thoughts from anyone on the panel? Thank you, Paul.
I mean, sure, thank you for your question. I mean, the panel this morning at 9 o'clock, we talked a lot about optimizing resources. There was cultural ways of force multiplying how it works within your organization if you don't have all the people you need. There's also a question of cooperation and also innovation for sure. We talked the ways in which you can use technology to save time, to spend more time where you need it in the field, moving and analyzing and learning. And on last week, we had a session on risk perception and the role perception plays in risk management. And one of the key takeaways, which is why we have it the way we do it in the UN, you need to structure your assessment. Otherwise, all these biases and all these things come into play, fear and everything. And so perception is important. It's important to hear it, but you cannot make an organizational decision based on individual perceptions. You need to have a structured way of codifying the way in which the organization wants to decide on its risk. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, and maybe just one concept of resources which we often forget about. It's not just about the human resources or the financial resources. You know, as humanitarian organisation, we also have access to member states who are a great resource for security risk management, using member states for advocacy for the preservation of life from civilians and staff is a resource. So we also have to consider what's outside our parameters and just think a little bit outside the box. But member states, donors, they are great resources to use. Thanks.
Please.
Boris Engelson, I am a journalist freelance, but duly accredited with the United Nations. That's why I may attend this fabled and fabulous HNP. Yeah, you see what I mean. Non-state actor, a non-state actor blasting a nuclear bomb from a truck in a major city, or the equivalent in biochemical weapon. Is it worst case scenario? Is it a black swan, black ostrich? Can it be totally excluded? Are town planning authorities or relief agencies planning for this kind of worst case scenario? This is my first question. And the second one is virtually the same, where the Bosnia war, Chechnya war, Ukraine war, after the collapse of socialist regime in Eastern Europe, black swans, or as inevitable as the end of a Greek tragedy?
Okay, thank you for the question. So basically, you're asking in terms of security risk management, you're speaking to aspects of planning and planning for specific events. And you mentioned chemical and biological events.
What I mean is that personally, I am certain that there will be such things happening during this scenario. That's why I try to grow old as fast as possible, not to endure it. And I like to know those young enough to be sure, certain to witness it, how they get ready.
So perhaps this is a question that fits into when we start to look ahead, what do we envisage as the future trends and development, and then how the security planning and security risk management processes build and fit into that, and how effective they are in this context. Paul, go for it, please.
Boris, right? Yeah, thank you, Boris. Asking a UN employee if, what they think about the predictability of a bomb going off in a city, not easy to answer. So let me just put it this way. Remember I said there was a difference between knowing foresight that something could happen in the environment and knowing that something could happen to your organization in this way, in this place. The more complex it is, the more difficult it is to predict, right? And also, the more complex the other side of the coin is, the more complex the plan is for a violent actor to commit, the more likely it can be disrupted, right? So there's all these ways in which that could fail. And so if that's the case, then you start to lower the likelihood that it's actually going to happen in this place at this time. If we say, will there be a non-state actor using a rogue nuclear weapon somewhere in the world in the future? You can say probably. But if you say tomorrow in this place, in this way, and that, it becomes less and less predictable.
Is it technically difficult?
I'll leave it to member states who run cities.
Please, you want to come in there?
Yes. There is another aspect to what you ask. Because risk management is done from the perspective of someone who will be affected by an event. So first question is, will I be affected by the event? Am I working in the city that you're talking about, like in any city? That's one. The second question is, or the second aspect of this is this within my remit to be able to respond to such an event? There are some events or there are some actions that my organizations or any organization for that matter will not be able to respond individually, and there are authorities or state structures that are tasked with dealing with such events. And now how we close this is by asking the question, if I know that there is a possibility that I will be exposed to such an event, is the work, is the aid that I am delivering, is the criticality of my humanitarian activity in this location worthwhile of taking these risks? Sometimes it's no. We have examples in the humanitarian world of cases where the answer was yes, even in very high likelihood cases where even human loss was pretty much certain. There have been humanitarian organizations that answered yes, we should be there because we can deliver and it matters.
Thank you very much. So I think, unless someone has a very pressing question, I think we're going to conclude in the interests of time. If there's any last comment from any one of the panelists in summation of the discussion this afternoon. Okay, so then it just remains, I think that we have a lot of content and a lot of issues to think about in terms of looking at future and how we envisage that future in terms of security risk management and security planning and all the collaborative strategies and paradigms coming together in support of that. So thank you very much for your attendance, and to those who joined us online, also a big thank you. Have a good evening. Thanks very much.